When we divide the colonies, the 13 colonies that eventually became the United States, into categories, the way it's usually done is we talk about New England in the north, and then south of them the middle colonies, below them the Chesapeake, and below them the lower south. Today we're going to talk about the Chesapeake, and that means just two colonies, Virginia and Maryland, that had a lot in common. Now, at this point, we should take a couple of minutes to talk about the types of colonies. There were charter colonies. Virginia is an example. That means that a company, a joint stock company, really an early form of the modern corporation, was given a charter, a document, a piece of paper by the English crown, the English government, to run the colony, to operate it. And they had certain obligations to the government of England, such as paying them taxes on their profits. Secondly, there were compact colonies. For example, the Mayflower Compact was an agreement among settlers of Plymouth Colony to form a government in which people are really agreeing with each other to form a government. They had the approval of the king. They needed that. But the basic structure is not based on a company, but on an agreement of people among themselves. And then finally, there were proprietary colonies. In Maryland would be an example, where one person was given the right to run the colony, to simply call the shots and make the decisions and rule over it. Now, eventually, they all became royal colonies, so that becomes a fourth type. Later on, they all came under the direct control of the king, and these were, at this point, they were called royal colonies. Virginia, for example, was made a royal colony in 1624, pretty early, because of the failures of the company to take good care of the colony. The first permanent British colony in North America was Jamestown, of course, named after the king at the time, James I. And this was founded in 1607, and it became the capital of the first capital of Virginia, which of course was named after the recently deceased Queen Elizabeth, who was known as the Virgin Queen. She had died in 1603 and was succeeded by James I. Now, the early settlers of Jamestown are very different from the settlers that we see in New England sometime later. And there are clues that we can gain about what they expected. They wanted gold and silver. They wanted quick riches, and then their idea was that they would return to England to live the rest of their years in comfort. They were not terribly interested in establishing a permanent society. Their makeup, demographic means referring to population. The makeup of their group, their population, is very revealing. They all had something in common. They were all men. Now, if you're not going to bring women, then you don't expect to set up a permanent colony. They were there to make a quick killing and then to return to England. It was only later, much later, that Virginia began to achieve a normal gender balance between men and women. Now, that makeup of these early settlers tells us that they were very much interested in economic gain. And this is very different from the early New England settlers who were interested in practicing their own religion without interference from the English crown. Typically, those who came to Virginia were the younger sons, like say the second sons of noblemen. least the leaders of the colony. The oldest son would very often inherit the land, and they would have the image of being the ones who stayed home on the land and carried on the family tradition. The younger sons had an image of being adventurers, kind of rogues, who were out to make a fortune in whatever way they could. And these tended to be the leaders of this group. Now, they had a lot of other people with them who were not upper class at all, the majority of those who came to Virginia in the 17th century came as indentured servants, and we'll talk about what that means in a little while. How successful were they? They were not. First problem is Virginia doesn't really have any gold and silver. And that meant they needed to be farmers. Well, they really didn't know very much about farming, and their image of themselves was that they were upper class and they really weren't interested in working. Well, if you're without any source of quick riches and you're not too interested in working, then you have a problem. And early Virginia had plenty of problems, as we'll see. The dividing line between the early, very unsuccessful Virginia and the later colony that became very wealthy, the key dividing line was tobacco. So it makes sense to talk about Virginia before the coming of tobacco and then Virginia after tobacco. The area was controlled by a Native American chief by the name of Powhatan. The early settlers were soon joined by Captain John Smith, who imposed, for a short time while he was there, imposed more order and more structure on this colony. But Smith wasn't there all that long, and in 1609 and 1610, there was a tremendous amount of starvation. It was known as the starving time. And there is some evidence that these English colonists even practiced cannibalism to avoid starving. Around this time, we have the beginnings also of conflict with Indians over issues like stealing food and simply expecting that they would be cared for, coming in with a sense of entitlement that this belongs to us, and generally doing a terrible job of relating to the native peoples. In response to this situation, there was a new leader of Jamestown by the name of Thomas Dale, and he administered some laws that he and a couple of other people wrote. I'll give you some examples. If you murmured, in other words, grumbled, or resisted in any way, or disobeyed in any way, for the first offense, you would be whipped. For the second offense, you would spend 3 years in prison, and for the third offense, it was death. These were extremely harsh laws. If you stole from Indians or committed any violence against them, the penalty was death. Now, you might wonder, stealing a little bit of food, why was that punished with the death penalty? Well, because that could bring down the wrath of Indians on the entire community. So there is some logic to this kind of law. If you dumped dirty wash water within 20 feet of a well, you would be whipped. Now, again, this tells us something. We don't have laws like this unless somebody was violating these principles. These were people who had very little concept of sanitation. There was a lot of disease, so this was simply an effort to prevent disease. If you stole food from anyone, that was the death penalty. Of course, this reflects, too, the tremendous food shortages and the real fear and reality of starvation. Now, Dale's laws had a certain benefit. They helped to create order and they helped the community to survive, but they had a drawback as well. The downside was, who would want to come to Virginia? Uh, People had to choose voluntarily to go there, and who would want to go to this kind of environment? This is actually a 17th century recruiting poster. Uh, it's called Nova Britannia, New Britain, offering most excellent fruits by planting in Virginia. Uh, Exciting all such as be well affected to further the same. This is dated 1609. Uh, like some travel posters today, this was not exactly realistic. Virginia is being painted as a wonderful place to get rich. It was not that in its early years. Now, the key discovery, the thing that makes all the difference, is tobacco. Um, in 1612, the settlers began growing tobacco in Virginia. Uh, John Rolfe developed a superior type of tobacco. He had been researching it and brought a variety of it to Virginia. He was married to Pocahontas. Um, I don't know that there's any evidence that Pocahontas taught him to do this, but she may have, uh, provided some information based on the Native American uh, growth of tobacco. Uh, but it was really more complicated than that. This was incredibly profitable, unbelievably profitable. And it created an enormous demand for labor because tobacco is what's called labor intensive. In other words, you need a lot of workers in order to grow it and process it. But if you had those workers, one worker could produce 100 times the cost of his labor, the cost, what you would have to pay to bring him to Virginia and pay the costs connected to this for that year. He could produce 100 times as much in the tobacco that you would gain from this. So there was tremendous uh, frenzy, desire to bring workers to early Virginia because that meant wealth if you were the ones who owned the land. If you were the workers, it did not mean wealth in most cases. Let's look at the growth of tobacco production. Let's say 1616, when it was just getting started, 2,500 pounds. 1618, 50,000 pounds. But this is just getting started. 1643 million pounds, and by 1688, 28 million pounds. By the eve of the American Revolution, 105 million pounds. This is what, by any measure, is explosive growth. This was enormously profitable to some people. Now, how did they get the workers? Well, the common method in the 17th century was indentured servitude. When we get to the late 17th and 18th century, in another presentation, we'll deal with African slavery because that became the preferred source of labor. But in the early decades of Virginia, they brought over indentured servants, and each landowner could get 50 acres of land granted to him if he would bring a worker over. That was called the headright system. So that was a tremendous motivation to bring people to Virginia. Now, an indenture is simply a contract. It's an agreement between the holder of the indenture. Typically, it could be a ship captain, for example, who recruited people in England. They would agree to work for a number of years, whatever the two parties agreed to. It could be 7 years, it could be 5 years, 4 years. If you were big and strong and looked like you would be a good worker, you would probably have to serve a shorter time, like 3, 4, 5 years rather than 7, because the ship captain who signed the contract with you knew that he could sell your services for a higher amount of money. This is an actual indenture. As I say, it's a contract. It's a legally binding agreement that in return for passage across the Atlantic, for that boat ride, you would agree to sell your labor for that amount of time. Now, ship captains would often misrepresent what was happening in Virginia. They would lie to the people who were being recruited. Things were not nearly as rosy as the picture that these captains painted. In fact, two-thirds of indentured servants died before they even finished their terms of service. Now, at the end of their terms of service, they would get freedom dues. If they're lucky, they would get land. But the land was not always in the best locations. It might be far away from the sources of transportation. It might be less fertile land. If they weren't so lucky, they would sometimes get, just money. And if they found that the price of land had gone up, then the money wouldn't be enough to buy the land that they had originally expected to buy. They would sometimes also get farm implements, things like that. And the goal was to set themselves up as planters. A planter was a large farmer who would typically here grow tobacco. Now, Maryland is very much like Virginia. It was a proprietary colony, unlike Virginia, and it was granted to the Calvert family. There were a succession of Calverts who had the title Lord Baltimore, and they were Catholic. Catholics were not welcome in England, but the king owed the family money, so they worked out a deal where they could become proprietors, or in other words, in charge of this colony, which they wanted to use as a safe haven for Catholics. Its economy was based on tobacco, very much like Virginia, and like Virginia, they used indentured servants and later on African slaves. The two colonies combined, Virginia and Maryland, are known as the Chesapeake. Now, there were major Indian wars in Virginia. There were two in particular. In 1622, in one day, a quarter of the English colonists were killed by Native Americans. In response to that, the company that was the London Company of Virginia was considered unequal to the task, could not really operate the colony very well. So the king took it over, and it became a royal colony 2 years after this first war. In 1644, there were 500 English killed. Now, why the wars? Because of the relentless expansion of the English wanting more and more and more land so they could grow tobacco. They were infringing on Indian lands. And there were all kinds of incidents of violence, before, during, and after these two major wars. The consequences were that the Indians were defeated. Eventually, they were driven farther and farther back into the interior, and many, many of them died. This was a pretty common pattern in English North America.